Hi, this is Andrew Smith, instructor at Fair State University and runner of artbysmitty.com. This is part 4 of the asset creation tutorial series using Autodesk 123D Catch and Autodesk 3D Studio Max. Part 5 I should say, is going to be going over how to take this chest that we created and drop it into an environment and apply HDR image rendering within 3D Studio Max. This is the final image that we're going to end up creating with our chest, and you can see we're using a backplate for the background image. We're using HDR lighting for the spheres and also the chest. And then we'll do a little bit of composite work in Adobe Photoshop to finish up this series. Alright, so first of all, I'm going to open my 3D Studio Max scene. And if I come here in perspective and full screen it, you can see we have a plane, just a primitive. We have a skylight. You can create a skylight by going to Create, going to Lights, going to Standard, and finding the skylight. We also have our treasure chest mesh that we retopologized and refined. And we have a simple camera, just a target spot camera. Nothing too flashy at this point. Okay, I'm going to hit Alt-W, exit full screen so we can see every view. And let's talk a little bit about HDR imaging. HDR imaging stands for High Dynamic Range Image. It is a single .hdr file composed of one photograph at different exposures. Another key term is a backplate. A backplate is an image that we use to render in the background that was taken in the same taken in the same place in the real world that we got our HDR image from. This method is called image-based lighting, or otherwise known as IBL. It's a 3D rendering technique which involves attaching an image into a spherical dome, or in our case a skylight, that contains the environment lighting and content information of your scene. This is often derived from the HDR image. The lighting characteristics of the surrounding surfaces with the HDR image applied are then taken into account when rendering the scene with global illumination and things like final gather. Okay, so let's get into this. First of all, I'm going to come here into my camera view and hit render. And we can see here we have our if I open up my material editor, we can come in here. This first material slot is applied to the treasure chest. It's just a standard material with a diffuse texture map that we created in Photoshop. The second material is a standard material with an ambient occlusion placed in the diffuse slot to give us these nice shadows down at the bottom. The ambient occlusion shader is working in turn with the skylight to give us these nice shadows. Okay, so I'm going to actually just hit the save button and save this as one JPEG, so we can always kind of come back and refer to it when we keep doing our different renderings and seeing what the differences are when we're using this HDR lighting. Alright, so remember we were talking about backplate. The first thing we want to do to load that is hit 8 on the keyboard, brings up our environment and effects, or I could go to rendering environment. Right now the background color is set to black, and we can see this in our render just with the black background. What we want to do is where it says none, hit that button, and we're going to go to maps, standard bitmap, and we're going to come to our desktop and we're going to find this HDR file. We're going to go to HDR images, airstrip, and we're just going to select our background image or our backplate, which is this image here. We'll hit open, and we can see it drags it and places it in our slot. Okay, so what we want to do next is I'm going to go ahead and hit M on the keyboard, brings up my material editor, and I'm going to go to modes and go switch this to the slate material editor. And this is basically a leaf out of Maya's hat. So if you're used to Maya, this should look kind of familiar. I'm going to collapse everything so it's nice and organized. I'll go to Scene Materials, and I'm going to double click on this backplate image, and it brings up our backplate node. Double click on that picture to enlarge it, double click on the green space here to bring up our menu, and this should look kind of familiar. So one thing with our backplate, we want to make sure that the coordinates, it's set to environment and it's set to screen. If it's not, you're going to get issues. So now that we have these settings, since we double checked to make sure those are good, close that out, come here and hit Shift Q, and that's going to render. So now instead of getting the black background, we're going to get that backplate snapped into our background. I'm going to go ahead and save this to my desktop as 2 JPEG. Hit save, hit OK. Alright, so we went from this to this. Nothing too fancy yet. Alright, our next step is going to be actually setting up the HDR image for image-based lighting. So what we want to do is we want to select our skylight. We need to come to the Modify tab, so we want to modify the properties of this skylight. And right now it's using a sky color, which is a nice white. And it's saying a map, but we don't have any maps. So let's go ahead and click this button. And we're going to go to Bitmap again. And this time we're going to come into our Airstrip folder. And we're going to go and say All Formats. And we'll select this HDR image. Okay, once I have it selected, I'm going to hit Open. Again, this might take a second because it's such a large file. I'm going to come in here and make sure it's at real pixels, 32 BP. Hit OK. Next, I'm going to hit, notice if we deselect the skylight, well, we're going to let Max think for a second. Okay, I'll deselect my skylight, I'll reselect it, and we see that this .hdr file is now put in our slot for the sky color. But we still need to change some settings, so let's hit M on the keyboard, brings up our slate material editor. And I'm just going to, well, I'm going to wait for it to load this, because again, this is a large image, and Max might take a little while to load it up in this new dialog box. Okay, so I'm going to take this bitmap and just hit delete. It doesn't actually delete it out of our scene materials, it just deletes it out of the editor here. So when you delete something in here, don't think that it's going to delete it out of your scene. Next, I'm going to select the skylight, and I'm going to click right here where the map's input. I'm going to drag it into my workspace, make sure it's an instance. Double click, and again with this we want to make sure it's set to environment, and we want to make sure it's set to spherical environment. So it acts as, you know, basically it's going to tell this image, this HDR lighting information, to come into our scene as a spherical environment and encompass our entire scene. So it lights everything from all the different angles with the HDR data. Okay, now that that's set, we're going to close that, and we're going to come back in here, and what we're going to do now is we're going to hit Shift Q, and we're going to render this out. Okay, so this is coming out really dark, but that's okay. That's kind of what we come to expect. So I'm going to, it's coming out dark like this because it's getting all the lighting information from that very dark HDR image. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this to my desktop, again for reference. I'm going to call it 3 JPEG, and hit OK. Alright, so we went from this guy to this guy to this guy. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back here, reopen my slate material editor by hitting M. And basically what I want to do now is edit this image and correct the gamma on it so that it's not so dark. And I could do it to the source file, or I could just right click here and go to Maps, Mental Ray, Gamma and Gain. And this allows me to edit this map inside my 3D package, so it's not actually editing the image itself. I'm going to click that button and connect these two nodes. I'm going to double click the gamma and gain, and what I'm going to do is uncheck reverse gamma correction, and I'm going to change the multiplier to something like 10. And this is an important part of the process. I'm going to come in here in my 3D space, select the skylight, and right now that HDR file is set to our sky color, but I'm actually going to grab this node here, click and drag, and place the gamma and gain node in that slot and hit instance OK. And since this gamma and gain is connected to the HDR, it's actually going to grab both of these and put them here, as long as they're connected in the material editor. So what I'm going to do now is close this out, come in here, and I'm going to hit Shift Q, and we're going to see what that gamma and gain node did to our render. It lightened it up, and it basically threw a gamma correction onto our lighting solution, which is a much nicer solution than what we had before with it being very, very dark. Let's go ahead and save this to our desktop as a JPEG, say 4 this time. Hit OK. Close it out. And again, we went from the standard rendering, and now we are at this rendering, and you can see the lighting changed quite a bit on this guy. It actually didn't change a terrible amount, but it changed just enough to get it feeling like this treasure chest is in the environment. One thing I don't like are these shadows down here, but we're going to edit those shadows later by editing the this material down here. Now obviously we want this ground plane to be see-through, and we only want to see the shadows cast onto it. So one way to do this is create a matte object. In V-Ray it's much easier, but we're using Mental Ray, so we have to kind of do a quirky workaround. I'm going to hit M on my material editor and just select these two and get them out of my workspace by hitting delete. And what I'm going to do now is double click on this floor texture, and that brings up the nodes and the connections. What I'm going to do is take this Ambient Occlusion node, and right now it's in my diffuse slot, but I'd like to actually move this down into my opacity slot. And I can double click this to make sure it's putting it in opacity. And everything looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is come back here, hit render. Okay, so now we're getting this ground plane, but we're now you can notice that we're actually starting to see through some of the areas with the shadow. But it's not exactly how we want. So I'm going to double click my ambient, or double click this main texture, and I'm going to change the ambient from gray to black, and we want ambient and diffuse to be black. So I'm going to come in here and re-render this. So now this is much better. I'm getting black where well, it's not where I want it, but I'm getting see-through in the shadow areas, which is good. But basically we want to inverse this operation in terms so that the shadow is black and everything else is transparent. So to do this, I can just double click my Ambient Occlusion shader, change the white to black and the black to white, inversing the two colors. So now if I come in here and hit render, you can see that now that plane is completely transparent, and the areas that are showing up from the plane are just the shadow areas. This will take a little bit longer to render because that backplate image is a very high quality image and it's very large, so we're just going to let this render. Okay, so now we can see that these shadows are getting caught down below. And you know, one thing that's wrong with this image is that the perspective angle is not correct, and also the chest is a little bit large. You know, but this chest in the first place is kind of doesn't really belong on an airstrip, so to speak. And I was looking at some beach HDR images, but this was a free image HDR pack online, so I decided to use this as opposed to spending $150 to put this in a nice sandy beach environment. So hopefully you guys can excuse that part of it and just learn from this lesson. So what I'm going to do now is I can come in here, close this out for now. I'm going to select this camera here in front view, and I'm just going to move it down to about here. And I'm going to hit F4 so I can see my wireframe in top view, and I'm going to scale this treasure chest down a bit and make sure it's actually grounded on this plane. Okay, so now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to re-render this and check my perspective, my proportions, and make sure it's lining up correctly. There's multiple ways to do this camera matching, and right now I'm just eyeballing it, test rendering it, and basically playing the wait for the paint to dry and reapply method. But there's definitely other ways to go about doing this, and we're not really going to cover that in this part of the HDR tutorial. We're just going over how to set up the HDR lighting and shadow objects. Okay, so this image is starting to come together, and it's starting to work pretty nicely. But one thing I noticed is that my shadows maybe aren't dark enough down here. So in order to change those shadows, remember the shadows aren't being created with the skylight or any lighting information. They're actually being created with that ambient occlusion material. So if I hit M on the keyboard and go to my ambient occlusion node, and I'm going to change this max distance to something like 10, and the spread, we'll drop that down a little bit to like 1.5, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift Q again and render this and see, you know, the updated shadows on that floor, that ground plane. Okay, so now we can come in here and take a look and notice that these shadows are starting to be a little bit darker, and it's starting to look a little bit more appropriate for this scene. I could edit them a little bit more, but I'm going to go ahead and call this good for now, just so I don't bore you with this tutorial. You can play with the settings in your own models however you like, and everything's starting to look pretty nice at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to come into my front view, and I'm going to go to create and create some geometry, and I'm going to create a sphere, kind of a medium size, fairly large sphere. We'll come in here in perspective, and we'll move this guy back a bit, and we're going to just duplicate him, call it good, move him over here, maybe scale him down a little bit. We might even let's go here. We'll move this, we'll create another one over here. I'm just holding shift while I'm moving. And we'll make this one really nice and tiny. And a little bit more. And set him on the ground plane. We'll call that good. And I'm going to take this original big sphere and actually duplicate him one more time. Move him a little bit closer to the camera so I can get some sense of depth in my render. Call this good. And I'm going to hit M on the keyboard, and I'm going to switch back to my compact material editor. Go to an open slot, and I'm going to call this one spheres. I'm going to change it from a standard to a mental ray arc and design material. And I'm going to change the color of this to be a little bit darker, and maybe give it a little bit of color, not much. Next, I'm going to come down here to my special purpose maps. I'll come in 3D space here, select my skylight, go to modify, and I'm actually going to grab this this HDR image that we have as the sky color for the image-based lighting and drag this into the environment slot on this arc and design material as an instance. So now if I double click this, we can see that the HDR image is being reflected in the arc and design material. So let's select all these spheres and apply the material. And I'm going to go ahead now and hit Shift Q and check out this render. You can see this is a great way when you're compositing 3D materials with either live action footage or images, backplates, HDR images, and basically combine them into these reflective materials so that the environment is reflecting the IBL and it's also reflecting 3D objects. So it's really a great way to kind of mesh everything together and make everything feel like it fits. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this image right now, and if we come in here and we take a look at this final comp, I added some depth of field to this. You can see it's nice and crisp and sharp here, but then it starts to fade off and get blurrier. And some of these spheres are actually reflecting some of that bright sunlight that's being cast from the sun, and also our treasure chest is even getting some of that sunlight, and we don't have that right now. You know, our render is pretty dark and basic. So the way to fix that is actually to come into my 3D space. Let's go ahead and come in here to my top view, and I'm going to go to Create, Lights, and Mental Ray Area Omni, and I'll plop that in there. Come to my camera view and move it up, and I'll place it about here where the sun's coming from on my scene. Go to Modify. I'm going to go to Area Light Parameters, say Show Icon and Render so that light's actually visible. I'll go to my Intensity Color and make this a nice orange-yellow, very, very bright. And let's set the multiplier to something like 8. And no decay type in this. And coming back down here, we're going to change the size or radius of this to be a little bit larger. So this light is going to be nice and big. And since I clicked Show Icon and Render, I'm actually going to move this light just to the left right there a little bit. And since I said Show Icon and Render, I can hit Render, Shift Q, and now we can see that that light is right here, and it's starting to actually give some of these spheres a nice highlight along the corners, and even along the side of the box here. And the light's placed not so nice right now because we're not even getting it right here, and this sphere would be affected by this sunlight. In our case, our light's not far enough back, so I'm actually going to move it back, and so I can start getting these nice bright highlights from that sun coming in. So we're basically just we're imitating the. So if I move this back here, some of those light rays should hit that sphere now. Okay, and I'm also going to move it back a little bit because I thought it was a little harsh on the side of our chest, and hit Shift Q and re-render this. So now I'm getting not so much light blowing up the side of my chest, and I'm starting to get some highlights on that little sphere, but I lost some of the highlights here on the tops of these other spheres, so hit Cancel. And how I'm going to fix that is just simply moving this slide up and maybe moving it over a tad and re-rendering. And basically trying to just imitate that direct light coming from the sun that we're not getting inside of our IBL or our HDR image. So there's always some kind of faking involved with doing these HDR images that a lot of people disregard and don't bother to do. Don't always expect the perfect lighting conditions to come from your HDR image. Just moving it, re-rendering, trying to get some of the light properties that we want. Yeah, it's starting to look better. Cancel. Again, I'm going to move this up a little bit, just so it hits the tops of these spheres a little bit better. Okay, that's looking a little bit nicer. And again, since we have no decay on that light, it's going to shine forever, basically. If we wanted to imitate an interior light that fades as it gets away from the light, we would go in here and change the decay type to inverse square so that it fades as the rays get further away from the light. Okay, cool. So this image is starting to look pretty nice. I'm going to hit Cancel, and I'm going to hit F10, and that's going to bring up my render settings. And I can go here to Indirect Illumination, and just make sure, diffuse bounces, maybe I'll set that to 2. And I already have 10 rays per final gather point, which is why it's giving me a custom message here. And we're just going to call that good. And I'll hit render one more time and we'll let this go. Okay, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this image plane and I'm going to scale it and basically make it really big. Okay, that's good. And I'm going to hit F10, and now I'm going to come into Render Elements, and I'm going to add a new element, and this element's going to be Z-depth. And I'm going to hit OK, and now I'm going to re-render this image. And it's going to render this image with a Z-depth pass that I can bring into Photoshop that will then allow me to add some z-depth to our image. The next step is going to be bringing this into Photoshop and putting some final touches and tweaks to this image to really make it look like this 3D is in real life. Okay, so now we can see we have our z-depth pass, and we also have our final render. So I'm going to go ahead and save these to my desktop. We'll save this one out as 5 JPEG. Okay, and now we can come back and kind of see our progress, our first to our last, and just the kind of process that we went through to get here. Okay, so next let's go ahead and open up Photoshop and import our 2 renders into the scene. Okay, so with this image brought in, I'm going to go ahead, come in here and say Image Adjustments, and then I'm going to come down here to Exposure, and we can play with some gamma correction stuff a little bit, or we can play with the exposures a little bit, and that looks pretty good. So we went from this to this, and I say that's an improvement. I can see things better. Next I'm going to grab my z-depth, Control A, Control C, and I'm going to come in here to Channels, select New, and it's going to create a new alpha and paste this into my alpha. I'm going to grab my brush real quick, and I'm actually going to paint out that sunlight, or that omni-light that I had, because we don't really want that to have any z-depth data. Okay, so I'll come back to RGB, turn off this alpha, and go to Layers, and I'm going to duplicate this background layer, and I'm going to next come in and go to Filter, Blur, Lens Blur, and I'm going to say make sure your source is set to alpha 1, and we want to invert it, and then I'm just going to come in here and click a space that I want the camera to focus on. Actually uninvert that, and we'll click here, and then we can say blur radius is a little bit higher, and so now since I extended that image plane way out to the distance, maybe that's a little bit much. Just a nice subtle blur in the background. Hit OK. So now we went, if I zoom in here, we went from this image to this image. Just again giving it some more realism to the photo. Next I'm going to duplicate these 2 guys, Control E to collapse, and I'm going to come in here and let's go ahead and I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to paint with a black, very low, and I might even color pick one of these dark colors in here, just so I'm not painting with dark black. I never like to do that. And I can come in here and start basically painting in some of my shadows that I didn't quite get in 3D. Again, I'm just going to run through this part of it really quick, but you can use your artistic skills to get something a little bit nicer than what I'm doing here now. And final render comps, this light wouldn't be shiny here. This ground plane would have no specularity because of this sphere would be blocking the specularity off of it. So there's all kinds of things we could go into to make this image more believable and realistic. But for the most part, we'll call this good. I'm going to come in here. I might actually throw an adjustment layer on here, get like a nice orange, just to kind of tie everything together. Select these, duplicate them, Control E to have another comp layer. Turn off all these previous, so we can kind of see what we went from this to this. And I don't even like this new one that much, so I'll bring the opacity down to 50, and now it's a little bit nicer. Okay, I'll duplicate these again, Control E, and image adjustments. Let's this time go ahead and go to vibrance, and I'm going to crank the vibrance up a little bit. Well, maybe not. Again, just trying to do some very basic passes here. So this time I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Lens Flare, and I'll do make sure this is right about here. And I'm going to say brightness really soft. Something like so. And I'm going to take this layer and just turn it way down in opacity, just so we get a slight lens blur coming on here, just so it's not overpowering the image. Next, I'll duplicate another layer, come in and say filter, render lighting effects, and I'm going to come in with a Omni, and I'm just going to kind of brighten this background up a bit. Next, I'm going to bring the opacity way down, and so we went from this image to this image, and again it's just starting to come together. Let's turn off, well, let's go ahead and duplicate all of these to a new comp layer, turn off all the ones before it, so we went from here to here. Some nice big changes. Next I'm going to go zoom into this treasure chest here, and what I'm going to do next is filter, noise, add noise. I'm going to add just a very slight amount of noise to this, so something like 0.2. And so now, you know, if you ever look at photographs taken, they always have a little bit of noise, depending on what kind of camera took it. So I just added a little bit of noise to kind of tie it together. And it's not very noticeable at all, but just small things like this can really help make something pop and make it look nice. So with this rendered, I'm going to go ahead and say, call this good. Let's take a look here at the one I spent a little bit more time on. And you know, I have some lens flares and some shadows that I painted, and I put the sphere here to kind of hide the fact that the sphere was not blocking out some of the specularity from the sun like it would be. But pretty, for the most part, you know, pretty similar in look and contrast. So that concludes this tutorial on HDR lighting. Let's go ahead and save that final image so we can go from one very first image to this. So pretty cool stuff. Alright, well, thank you for watching, and hopefully you guys can have some fun with that Autodesk's 123D Catch program and maybe some HDR lighting.